We're going to go just right back to the fruit trees again. We talked about ornamental trees, and we're maintaining central leaders whenever possible. We're removing included bark, cutting for strength, selective removal of branches to keep a nice sturdy shape. You know, we're developing strength over a long period of time. We're not reducing for size. We're letting it go. As that tree grows, that's what they do, so you just let them grow. If you get a real abundance of like airplanes caught in it or something, then you might want to reduce it a bit, but otherwise, let it go. There's no real reason to cut a tree just because it's getting bigger. If it's in the wrong spot, yank it, cut it, get a new one in there that's going to stay small, smaller pieces. But fruit trees, we have to kind of understand a few more things just about fruit trees really quick, and that is that we want to look for the fruit-bearing portions of the trees. And it's one of the things that is highly recommended is if you do have clients that have fruit trees, is to get a production guide that gives you, like here in British Columbia we have these guides available which tell you pretty much everything you ever want to know about fruit production that you'd ever want to know, and from a professional standpoint. So it tells you everything about the spraying, the pruning, the trimming. And one of the things it does is it shows you all the different types of wood that produce fruit. So on all the different types of trees. So whether it's plum trees or cherry trees or apple trees. Apples and pears produce little spurs. And a spur is just it's very identifiable if you ever see a spur on a tree. So you'll see a branch come out and then it'll stop, and then there'll be this little weird looking thing that's got like a little fat branch on it, and then it'll usually have another twig growing off of it here. But this little spur is a little fat little ball of branch, and that's where the fruit comes. So when you're pruning, you can go through and thin those out, right? Just leave one here, one there, one here, one there. Each one will produce 2 or 3 pieces of fruit, and then whoever's doing the thinning will take out those smaller, the smallest fruit or the imperfect fruit, and keep one nice piece of fruit on each spur. Cherry trees also produce a spur-like little stub that will produce lots of fruit. They will also produce on just slightly mature wood, usually when it's about a year and a half old. It's starting 2 years old, it's starting to produce some flowers. But with peach trees, apricots, that sort of thing, you have to keep wood from the previous year, because whatever grew last year, that's what they're fruiting on this year. So it's really critical. We've gone in and seen people prune trees sometimes, and they've removed every little bit of growth from last year. And you go, well, there won't be any fruit this year.
Oh, you removed every little bit of
fruit.
everything,
You know? Yeah, exactly. And so the rule of thumb, though, generally, like with fruit trees, you can take quite a bit off every year. You might be taking off 30% of a tree, or maybe even more sometimes. Sometimes even up to 40% or 50% of a fruit tree, depending on what it is. But on shade trees, 20% is the magic number, right? That's sort of your upper end. In the extreme cases, you can go to 25% in one cutting, but it's really 20% or less. And that's why I kind of like this idea that you go to a tree, you go to a property, and you eyeball the trees all the time for problems. And if you happen to see branches that are rubbing, well, if they're rubbing, then you're going to take one out before it causes a problem. And if it's already opened up a wound, we might have to take them both out. And you're removing the dead wood as you see it. It's just ongoing, is the pruning thing. In the wintertime, you have that ability to go through and look at the tree carefully, stand back from a distance, you can see the framework. And you will see that you're sometimes better off with trees that have never been touched, that people have never pruned. You go to a property and there's a big old tree there that's been there for 35 years and nobody's touched it. You go in and you go like, wow, can I prune that one? It's so easy to prune. You're just like, oh, thank God nobody's wrecked it yet. All right, and then you go in there and you can just do a few cuts and clean it up, take the dead wood out. Huge improvement, and it's fun to do. You go to some trees where people have hacked them and they've cut the ends off them and they've done everything wrong, and then you're trying to follow the rules of pruning, so you're going like, well, I have one cut to do on this tree and it's about 6 inches off the ground, and that'll be it, man. Let's get a new one in here. And why wait, like just identify it and make a decision, and ideally get a good tree in there. So yeah, I'm with pruning. And the term crown is used a lot when we talk about trees. There's 2 crowns on a tree. There's the crown of the root system, right? So there's a root system underground here, and the roots grow underground, and this is the crown of the root system, and this is the crown of the tree. So the only reason that I say that is that sometimes they'll use this terminology to say, like, dig around the crown, where the roots attach, and have a look to see if you find any issues or problems, or girdling roots, that sort of thing around the base. And it's the same with a shrub, you know, the shrub has the root crown and then the branch crown. And sometimes, I've just found sometimes that it gets a little bit confused sometimes that there's actually the two different types of crowns. Now, other types of trees that you may run into that I should just touch on really quick are the, like we talked about briefly about the fruit trees, but some of the nut trees. And walnut trees, big issue. People treat them like fruit trees, right? They're not going to produce any fruit if you keep cutting them, right? It takes years for walnut trees to mature to produce walnuts. About 12 years. If you plant a walnut, you get about a 12-year wait before that thing's going to produce. And then when they start producing, they produce a mass of walnuts. But as soon as people start pruning them, the wood never gets a chance to mature, and it always stays juvenile, and the things just really don't work. So walnut trees are enormous, huge shade trees that produce nuts. Hazelnuts are really just like a giant shrub. There's no such thing as, well, I guess there's occasionally you'll find some species that'll produce a single trunk, but usually they're a grove. So that means they grow tons of branches everywhere, suckering from the root systems. They're a disaster in most cases. So good for old properties or surrounding areas, but you wouldn't put them into somebody's garden unless they were clear on that fact that it is a grove. If you want to have a grove of hazelnuts, then go for it. Other trees that grow like that would be like poplar trees, like trembling aspens. They don't grow one, they grow many. Yeah, this is exactly just covered. I wanted to talk a little bit about hedges, because as we were just talking a little bit about how when we do this kind of effect, what happens. So just really clarifying the deal with hedges and how to do a hedge. And there's nothing wrong with hedge trimming, it's a process. But in a best case scenario, hedges are always pretty much the same, and they should always be trained just slightly pyramidal, so that they're narrower on the top than they are on the bottom, and then trimmed into the shape, where they sometimes have multiple stems. But they're pyramidal and they're trimmed. The thing with trees is, or most hedging trees, is that they, as long as you're trimming them from the time they're young, and you say I'm planting a hedge, so you plant the hedge, and you trim it, the sides and the top, a couple times a year for its whole life. And you know, every time you trim it, it's always going to look great. It's going to grow. Every time you cut it, it forms all those little antlers and stuff on the sides, and it keeps filling in, and you keep trimming it, and it just gets better and better over the years. You feed it, make it grow. You might trim it 3 times a year, 4 times a year, and you get a beautiful hedge. Slightly pyramidal, and that's so that you get growth right from the bottom, right? If you trim in a different shape, like a light bulb shape or something, you always get bare branches on the bottom. You don't get growth because it shades itself. So all the hedges should be slightly pyramidal. But if you take a hedge row, that's the difference between a hedge that's pruned and a hedge row. Hedge rows, they just plant cedars in and walk away for 20 years. And 20 years later, somebody says, God, those are getting big. We should trim those. No, it's just bad news, because as soon as you do that, you've completely disrupted the natural shape. And by the time these things get to be a pyramid cedar or something that has to be 20 feet high, we're starting to look at it as if it's a tree. So we have to start pruning it like a tree. You have to get in and carefully prune it. Just talked about how we never cut the end off a branch, so we would never top a tree then either, right? And why would you top a pyramid cedar? You can do it, but what happens is they form all these antlers and growth out of the top of the tree, and it'll always look weird. The sides will be skinny and scrawny, hardly any growth inside. You'll be able to see into it all the way up, and then it'll have a crown on the top of it, like a hat crown, sticking up where it's been pruned off. So it'll be really, really noticeable. So the general rule with those is that, you know, if somebody wants to trim it, they have to have a really good solid reason why they're going to trim it. As long as they have a reason, like it's growing up into it's gone all the way up to the second floor, and now it's going into the soffitting, right? So it's like, well, you can prune it. So you cut it down wherever you want, but you'll always see that kind of a weird growth habit there, right? So decisions must be made. But generally, that's a single cedar standing by itself. You wouldn't usually see that problem with a whole row of cedars or any type of thing. But the thing with any of these hedges is they require maintenance. They're high maintenance because they need 3, 4, 5 trimmings a year. Boxwood hedges, privet hedges, you know, Toniaster hedges, all the evergreens. You can make just about anything into a hedge, right? There's one report or program that was developed where they took pretty much all the common plants and made them into hedges. Pretty much everything. They had trees, maples, everything. They made them hedges. And the one thing they discovered was you can make a hedge out of anything. It just depends on how much work you want to put into it. But the issues with hedging are just the same as everything else, right? Your hedge trimmers have to be sharp and ideally clean. One of the issues that we have when we're pruning is that the pruners that we use, the saws, the hedge trimmers, they develop disease tissues on them, right? So you're cutting along trimming, and you cut off a bunch of diseased growth. So now your hedge trimmer or your pruners or your saw is permeated with diseased tissue. And you go and trim a healthy plant, and you cut right into it with the disease, with an infected scalpel. And what happens is, of course, the tree starts to die back from that point. If anybody's seen where people have gone with hedge trimmers and you see the dead tips, dark brown tips on those things, especially with dogwood shrubs, from the hedge trimmer. So having clean tools. If you ever need to sterilize your tools, you use rubbing alcohol, and you just put it in a spray bottle and spray your tools down, and it sterilizes those blades. You have to have it clean, like relatively clean, a little bit of water, and then you sterilize it. But what happens is that just that knowledge that when you're removing dead, diseased, and dying wood, the diseased wood is on your pruners, and you're going to be spreading it around a little bit. So just awareness. It's not something that's absolutely necessary in every case, not in the case of orcharding, but it's not a bad idea just to have that awareness of what you're doing. When you go in and you see something that's really bad, black, greasy stems, and you're cutting them out, black, greasy stuff, that's usually bacterial. Bacterial diseases spread like crazy, right? So that's where it's always good to have that little bit of rubbing alcohol. It's just isopropyl alcohol. You can have it in your vehicle, and it's good to go for sterilizing your tools as needed. But you can do your hedge trimmers too. Just spray them down.
Does some of the dieback occur? Like, I've always wondered when you see some guys just oil the crap out of their blades, and then they're always cutting and oiling, and always wondered like if that's going to cause, because the oil will get on the little tips, and is that sometimes called?
Some types of lubricants will cause problems.
Yeah.
But and I don't even know of I know that like obviously WD-40 doesn't work. We know that doesn't work at all. It's like the worst possible lubricant.
Well, yeah.
It's good for it's a water dispersant thing. It's not a lubricant. But if you use actually other types of products like they're specific to hedge trimmers, then you still, what I would suggest is to actually look up like through an arborist magazine or arborist websites and ask those questions directly to those guys, because hedge trimmers absolutely they need to be lubricated all the time, and if you look at the recommendations, they'll say every 10-15 minutes you got to spray them down because they get overheated, and there's a lot going on there, right? But I haven't really seen any actual symptoms of damage caused from the oil itself.
Okay.
But then there's some pretty crazy chemicals in
Yeah,
there too.
well, that's always
you find some lubricants, and why do they last so long? I don't know. But they're really something going on there that's making them stick and last. So I guess that thing with hedges is just remember that a hedge is a hedge. Once you trim it, you're always trimming. And as soon as you go into trimming shrubs, well, you're treating them like hedges, so you got to trim them all the time. So it's great for the guys who do the maintenance because they got lots of work because they're going to always have to come back. There's nothing really wrong with it if you get a job and you happen to have a property where you have to do tons of hedge trimming. It's money in the bank because it's going to need it another. Come back in 3 weeks, it's going to need it again, right? It's ongoing forever. If you're developing the plan yourself and you're the guy in charge of putting those plants in, do the research first. Get plants that look like that you don't have to trim. Put them in there and stay in those spaces. And it's just you don't do anything to them, right? You just let them grow. And we're going to talk a little bit about roses again. We covered roses a little bit in some of the other classes. We were talking a little bit about just through general maintenance, but the awareness that roses don't have to be pruned. We talked about that before. How depending on the type of rose, people always say to me like, "Okay, how do you prune roses?" And I just say, "Well, what kind of roses do you have?" Because there's tons of different types of roses. Roses come from China and from Russia and from Canada and from countries all over the world have roses. It's a humongous family. So what happens is that each one of those is a different type it's a different animal. They all have different options. So I guess the question is how much room do you have? This is a plant that sometimes you're pruning really hard because you don't have enough room to grow it. Because people think of roses as being very small.
They suck to prune.
Well, that's why you always prune with these, right? That's my rose pruners right there. I can get right down inside, grab the branches. I never touch them. Anyway,